Hello and welcome to the King's Chambers Planning Podcast. I'm Philip Robson. This is the second of what appears to be weekly but may not end up being weekly. We'll see how we go of these lockdown editions, where not only can you hear us but you also get the pleasure, if you want to define it that way, of seeing us. That pleasure this week comes from other members of King's, Jonathan Easton and Piers Riley-Smith. And our special guest, Matthew Stafford, the Senior Planning Manager from St Modwen. The topic for today is vacant building credit. Now, this may seem like something of a planning backwater and one for aficionados, but I think, as we will hear through the discussion, one that has potentially a significant role to play in achieving what is a clear government objective, which is backing brownfield, brownfield first, however you want to frame it. It's certainly a truism of the recent years to say that the direction has always been to bring forward brownfield before you end up on greenfield sites. And VBC was seen as one of the ways of incentivising that form of development, of achieving that stated policy objective. What we'll discuss is what the policy includes, how it operates, where the issues lie in terms of the national policy itself, in terms of the local practical application, and then of particular relevance and particular importance to hear from Matthew of what this feels like on the ground. Is it having the effect that national government would like it to have? So first, I think, Piers, if I could hand over to you, if you could just set out in as brief and accessible as way as you possibly can, precisely how the VBC policy operates.
Of course, thanks, Phil. Well, I think to start with a sort of pithy summary, the main concept is that where there's a redevelopment of a vacant building, then a proportionate discount should be made to the affordable housing requirement. That discount based on the existing gross floor space of a vacant building. That was introduced in a written ministerial statement, I think, back in November 2014, and it's fair to say it didn't have the best of beginnings, a bit of a difficult start. It was immediately challenged. It was therefore withdrawn, wasn't actually reinstated, the written ministerial statement, till May 2016, after the Court of Appeal found it lawful. Just one interesting point to come out of that those cases was that one of the arguments was that it was unlawful because it was going to be applied as a blanket policy. That was rejected by the Court of Appeal, and I think it's going to tie into some of the themes we're going to touch on today, which is in effect that vacant building credit is very broadly expressed at a national policy level, which allows for it to be flexibly applied by local authorities and perhaps detailed in local policy. Turning to very briefly look at vacant building credit as expressed in national policy, where you'll find it is at the end of paragraph 63 in the NPPF. Just one short sentence: to support the reuse of brownfield land where vacant buildings are being reused or redeveloped, any affordable housing contribution due should be reduced by a proportionate amount. Then there's a footnote 28, which says that equivalent to the existing gross floor space of the existing buildings, this does not apply to vacant buildings which have been made abandoned. And in terms of the wording of national policy, that's about it. If you want to put more meat on the bones, you need to turn to the National Planning Practice Guidance, in particular the section on planning obligations, of which there are only 3 paragraphs of it which are relevant to VBC. That's paragraphs 26, 27 and 28. 26 really explains what it is. It emphasises what you mentioned, that it's an incentive for brownfield development, and makes clear that it applies to vacant buildings that are either being brought back into use or being demolished. 27 is where we get into, well, actually, how does that process work when you're applying a VBC, vacant building credit? In short, and I'll throw some maths at you, I'm afraid, at the end of this, if the proposed development is going to result in an increase in floor space over and above the current vacant building, then a credit should be applied in relation to the affordable housing contribution that would usually be applied. So that credit is actually calculated by taking the equivalent of the gross floor space of the relevant vacant building either being brought back into use or being demolished, and then that is deducted from the overall affordable housing contribution calculation. Here's the maths I warned you about. If you had a proposed development...
We need a symbol that flashes up.
A maths alert. And I'm afraid this is really pushing my GCSE maths to the limits. But if you had a proposed development with a floor space of 30,000 square metres, which is replacing a vacant building of 20,000 square metres, and also there was a local policy requirement for 30% affordable housing, to get your vacant building credit, you would deduct the 20,000 square metres from the 30,000 square metres. So you'd be left with 10,000 square metres. That's a third of the proposed floor space. And so the affordable housing requirement is reduced to a third, so it becomes 10% from 30%. So far, so simple. However, a lot of people listening will be asking, well, what actually is a vacant building? That's probably quite an important concept for a vacant building credit. It's not defined in the MPPF, and paragraph 28 only provides really a few bits of guidance. The only guide we get in the MPPF is from footnote 28, which I mentioned, which says it doesn't apply to buildings that have been abandoned. But what is an abandoned building? When has a building been abandoned? The PPG, so paragraph 28 of the PPG, makes clear, it gives some guidance as to the law, but says it's a matter for each local authority to determine on a case-by-case basis. The other point about paragraph 28 in the PPG, it suggests it may be appropriate. So not laying down the law to any local authorities, but suggesting it may be appropriate for local authorities to consider two further things when asking whether a building is vacant. Firstly, whether the building has been made vacant solely for the purposes of redevelopment. So that's really aimed at, as it were, tactical vacancy, making a building vacant to get the benefit of this credit. Or the second maybe element to consider is whether the building is covered by an extant or recently expired planning permission for the same or substantially the same development. So really the answer to
the position that we're left in is you've got a national policy which sets out a fairly clear intention in order to incentivise building. If you've got a vacant building that you're going to be getting rid of, then to encourage you to bring forward that site, you won't have to deliver the full amount of affordable housing. They've then set a series of requirements. You need a building, it needs to be vacant. We need to look at whether or not it's been abandoned, but it leaves a huge amount to judgment. And you know, far be it from a panel including three barristers to say that judgment is a problem, because without judgment there's no argument, and without argument we'd all be milkmen or whatever alternative careers may be most suitable to us. Jonathan, in your experience of having advised quite significantly on the application of VBC, where do you see those battlegrounds? What are the issues that clients need to be thinking about?
Well, before I do that, I need to ask a very important question, and that's this. Piers, are you available for maths homeschooling?
I'm currently signed up to BBC Bite Size, so they've got the contract with me.
Fantastic.
I should say that there is a background note for those that are listening. You can go onto the King's Chambers website and download a paper which sets out, typed up, not the original crayon version, of the maths that we went through in advance of this. Jonathan.
Fantastic. No, Piers has already identified one of the key battlegrounds. I mean, my take on vacant building credit VBC is this really. It's a potentially important tool to incentivise development of brownfield land. That's the stated aim, and that's a clear stated aim. But what isn't clear is the policy itself. So vacancy is a really good example, because Piers has already read it out, but there's all the MPPF talks about is where vacant buildings are being reused or redeveloped. That's essentially it. So we don't know from national policy or practice at what point does the local authority or decision maker make the determination about whether a building is vacant or not. We don't know, most importantly, what period of time a building needs to be vacant for in order to qualify for vacant building credit. So that's a real issue. And a broad theme, we may come back to discuss this in due course, is that, you know, as a developer, as a site promoter, one of the things you really want to have is a degree of certainty about how a particular policy is going to be applied. In the case of VBC, the national policy in practice is so vague as to, I suspect, put off a number of developers even considering it, because there isn't the certainty there when planning a scheme. So back to vacancy. Some local authorities use the SIL regulations as a proxy for determining the period during which a building needs to be vacant before qualifying. And I'm sure Regulation 40, Sub-Regulation 11.2 of the SIL regulations is something that's imprinted on everyone's memory, but just in case it's not, it provides a definition of an in-use building. In-use building is one that contains a part that's been lawful for a continuous period of 6 months within the period of 3 years, ending on the day planning permission first permits the chargeable development. So if a building, some local authorities say, does not meet this definition, it's vacant. So that's the closest I think some local authorities have been able to get to providing a relatively clear picture as to how long a building needs to be vacant before qualifying for VBC.
Sorry, it's a good question, Jonathan. That's not a requirement of statute, is it, to use that definition? That is something that authorities are importing themselves.
No, I think some local authorities see a crossover between vacant building credit, which is to incentivise the use of brownfield land, and similarly the in-use building discount in relation to SIL. So they see a degree of crossover. And I think, to be honest, for the want of anything better in national policy and guidance, local authorities perhaps can't be criticised for looking for something that is as close as possible. My problem with that, using the SIL regulations as a proxy for a period of vacancy, and I know that Piers might have a slightly different view, expressed respectfully, of course, the difficulty it presents to me is that in order to qualify under this proxy definition, a building is going to have to be empty for 2.5 out of the last 3 years in order to be quote unquote vacant. So that hardly assists, in my view, in incentivising brownfield development, because during that period of time, you as a developer or a landowner or site promoter are going to be having to face the ongoing maintenance and security costs of vacant buildings. Those costs in the longer term might actually end up outweighing the saving you would make if you applied a full amount of vacant building credit. It also doesn't allow any consideration really of the particular circumstances in which a building became vacant. What if there was a fire? What if there was a flood? What if there was a business failure and everybody accepted that there was no prospect at all of this building being used for anything else in the future? That proxy SIL definition means that you would still have to wait on the face of it for 2.5 years. Now, I accept there's a degree of sense in having some local policies that are clear as to the period of time. And so I think ultimately one has to toss up the advantages of having a clear policy with the disadvantages of applying a SIL regulations definition or something similar, which was never designed for that purpose. So vacancy is a problem. VBC viability is another issue. Now, I've come across a number of local authorities who seem to think that the application of vacant building credit can only be taken advantage of in circumstances where a scheme would be unviable without it. Now, I think that's wrong, that there's no direct policy link between VBC and viability. So they have their own separate homes in different corners of the framework, in different corners of the PPG. The PPG guidance, such as it is about VBC, doesn't identify any reference to viability. And if you just trace this through and think of examples, so if a development is viable without vacant building credit, then there would be no reason to apply a discount, any credit at all. That would emasculate the policy. So if a development's unviable, even with vacant building credit, then you as a developer or site promoter would have a strong argument, independent of VBC, that the full affordable housing requirement shouldn't be required. So, and in some circumstances, that might be an easier sell to some local authorities. So if I had a plea to the many thousands of people who are listening, who have any influence, it would be to provide a degree of clarity in national policy, and if applied at a local level, then local policy, to distinguish between vacant building credit and viability.
It's not a policy requirement. Matthew, one for you perhaps. It must be, for the land promoter, it must be something that's in your mind, because the point that Jonathan makes about, well, if we have to wait for 2.5 years before this can be, this vacant building can result in us taking advantage of the vacant building credit. But for that 2.5 years, we've got to keep this site empty, secure, maintained, not dangerous. And you're thinking about a bigger picture. You're looking at money being spent in various different items of the checkbook. So whilst not a policy requirement, it must be a practical consideration.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the intention in terms of brownfield first, I don't think anyone argues with the principle of that. The reality, though, in practice, unfortunately, is that uncertainty around the tests to be met just increases the risk for a developer, and that risk is something that's very hard to quantify, especially when it leads to time delays. And we can certainly quantify the costs of delays with existing buildings that are void. Like you said, the void rates, the security costs, just the issues of something going wrong for a company. They're all major incentives to sort of say, on this occasion, unless you've got something at a local level or a precedent locally that steers you down the path of the route through VBC, it makes it very difficult to want to pursue that, because it just introduces so many more risks, especially when you've got a situation where it potentially isn't the most viable course for the scheme in any event. So it would eventually lead you down the path of sort of looking at the viability. And the reality is, in terms of vacant building credit, it does only address affordable housing, whereas in reality for a project, and certainly viability, there's many other factors that you'd be looking at when it comes to Section 106 obligations and the cost of a development. And sometimes the easiest thing is really to try and crack on with demolition if the building is genuinely vacant, can't be relet. That is the most practical option for a lot of companies, especially ourselves, in the short term. And it'll become more important now, where companies are looking to preserve cash and don't want to be paying out for abortive fees when they can see a way forward with a viable scheme. So it takes you full circle, really, in terms of trying to promote brownfield first.
To get that certainty, is it something that you think that developers would like to see being woven into emerging local plans, that there would be additional clarity on how VBC could be applied?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you could, pick up a plan policy or an SPD that derives from that sets clearly out what that council expects in terms of the tests. And if you can then run through those series of tests and say, yes, we can meet all those, therefore the case for vacant building credit can be clearly made and ultimately accepted in a very short space of time, would make its application, much more sensible and easier for everyone in the short term. The difficulty at the moment is, a lot of authorities don't have a huge amount of experience in certain VBC cases, and therefore you are wondering and trying to work your way through with them whether you're going to come to a favourable conclusion. And if that then takes 6 months, you think, well, would we have been better simply just getting on with the scheme at the outset, running the numbers on viability? And vacant building credit became a part to play, great, but it doesn't sort of form that central pillar of at the outset with a brownfield site that I think the government's intention really is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is that, Jonathan, is that something that you're seeing much of in terms of local authorities bringing it forward, or is it something that you think there's clearly a bit of a push needed, perhaps even from central government?
In answer to your first question, Philip, not seeing an awful lot, if any, frankly, policies on vacant building credit in emerging local plans. And based on what Matthew said, and I think we probably all agree with this, is that the need for clarity is stark. Yeah. So insofar as local authorities are able to influence things, it would make a lot of sense, I think, to have clear VBC policies in their local plans, backed up perhaps by a subsequent SPD. And insofar as the development industry can influence that, then representations to emerging local plans that say, well, you really need local authority X, a policy in your emerging plan which talks about vacant building credit, because without it, there's this lack of certainty that we've all spoken about. So I know the government's got lots of other things they are concerned about at the moment, but I think in combination, local authorities should sit up and take notice of what is likely to be a key issue moving forward. There's going to be more vacant buildings.
Post-lockdown, for a whole host of reasons, there may be an increase in vacant buildings. And there will necessarily want to be a push, both at local government level and central government, to incentivise developers to build for all the economic benefits that can bring. But of course, all local authorities are at different stages of their plans. Some have newly adopted, some are emerging, some are miles away. Is there something, Jonathan, perhaps that, as a general point, if the local authority hasn't got its emerging plan or doesn't have a plan that is currently emerging, is there anything else that can be done to provide clarity about VBC?
Well, I mean, people are discussing at the moment the various things the government could or should be doing in terms of providing greater clarity and assisting the development industry and local planning authorities with how to operate as we come out of the lockdown. So written ministerial statements are some of the things that have been spoken about, changes to PPG or other options that people are considering, or a Dear Chief Planning Officer letter. So, I mean, any one of those mechanisms, I mean, it doesn't have to be terribly complicated, could say something on the lines of we positively encourage local authorities to adopt VBC policies. And for those who have a recently adopted plan without it, please provide some good practice guidance so that everybody knows where they sit. I mean, that would be a help. That would be a push from central government, which would, I think, be of some assistance.
I mean, does that mean that there's a general consensus, Piers, is your view that the intention is to incentivise brownfield land? Matthew and Piers, is your position that it is a policy that can work? The fact is it's just not being applied and not giving the certainty to developers that they need?
Well, I think to pick up on a few of the points that are discussed there, yes, I do think the purpose is to incentivise brownfield development, and actually the PPG gives a slight nudge to local authorities in applying it, where it says local planning authorities should have regard to the intention of national policy. There's a steer in the PPG. However, in this discussion, the other side of the equation is occasionally forgotten, which is that paragraph 63 appears in the NPPF dealing with affordable housing. And the point is that the SOP, as it were, to get incentivised brownfield development is that the developer avoids what they should be contributing to with affordable housing, which is also an important aim. So I think that's the reason why we're seeing this ability of local authorities to adopt criteria or to have a certain threshold by which they consider a building to be vacant. I think why it's really important for both developer and for local authorities, in particular in my mind, to provide clarity on what they consider a vacant building to be. Jonathan's mentioned some factors already concerning SIL and concerning how long something's been marketed, how long it's been left vacant. There's a lot of scope for local authorities to decide what factors they consider to be relevant, and as long as those factors aren't irrational at this point, without any clearer guidance on the national level, as long as they are defendable as rational factors, they can rely on them. But the issue for local authorities, and I think not enough local authorities are realising this, if they want to apply VBC, but they haven't made it clear, or the best option would be to set it on a policy footing, what they consider a vacant building to be, if they're subject to an appeal, it takes the power out of whether their criteria are irrational or not. Instead, to do these criteria influence or persuade an inspector? It's then the inspector's planning judgment as to what's a vacant building. So councils, without putting these things on a policy footing, are, as it were, robbing themselves of the ability to rely on the criteria and instead relying on arguments if it goes to appeal.
I was going to say, I think the point there that Piers made about a developer being seen to avoid the sort of local obligation is sort of paramount as well, because I think whilst officers will be interpreting and advising on policy from a developer's perspective, that's the recommendation we always hope we get when we go to committee, but ultimately the politicians in an area will be the ones that make that decision, and sometimes they might not see a scheme that potentially is viable, providing no affordable housing as the way forward for that authority in terms of precedence. And very much so, I think most authorities now are very keen to say that the NPPF also stipulates minimum 10% affordable housing, with no reference to how that interacts with vacant building credit. So the vacant building credit works perfectly in isolation, but the reality is the policy doesn't work in isolation when you apply it to a scheme, and the council will be looking at a whole myriad of issues and ultimately looking for a developer to come up with a scheme and that makes the most sustainable option for the developer and also the local community and the authority. So it's very much part of a negotiation, I think, vacant building credit at the moment, and it would be much more helpful if there was some more guidance for, I suppose, both parties, the local authority in terms of how they can apply policy, and from a developer, well, how far does vacant building credit actually go when you weigh it up in the round, because ultimately you don't want to be stuck in a long negotiation with authority, knowing that you're always paying out costs on a vacant building when you could demolish it, but you have to keep it standing and vacant until the time of a decision. And ultimately, if you never agree and you have the scenario where you went to appeal, that's 3 or 4 years. And I think Jonathan said earlier in the conversation, in many scenarios, if you didn't have a high affordable housing provision and you have void rate, very quickly the actual usefulness of vacant building credit could be very, very quickly eroded. So from a developer's perspective, it puts you off if you feel that that's the route that you're going to end up going down.
I mean, that's one of the points that came up in the podcast last week on retail, and it may be trying to look at things in a positive light, given the current circumstances. But post-lockdown, there will be arguably greater political space for previously difficult decisions, or decisions which previously may not have been made but remain difficult to be made. And that might include, for example, Matthew, like you say, the prioritisation of building and bringing brownfield forward, and accepting that requires a potentially politically unsavoury fact that you might not get policy compliant affordable housing as part of it. So it could be something that in the space that will exist post-lockdown, that those discussions, those negotiations which operated in the dark as part of previously as part of the viability discussions, could come into the open as part of how vacant building credit could operate through local plans and through guidance at local level.
I mean, just on that though, isn't that political decision already made? Because as Piers rightly pointed out, the vacant building credit paragraph is in the section under affordable housing. And so what the government's already saying in the NPPF is that there may be certain circumstances where the government considers it more important from a policy perspective to deliver brownfield land than deliver a policy compliant amount of affordable housing. It could be said, I suppose, that political message is already embedded in the framework. But if that's a difficult decision that the government's already made, it perhaps, according to what Matthew's experience, is perhaps not something that's filtered through to a local level. And this may well be another situation where the government perhaps needs to clarify exactly what its intention was when it first brought in VBC all those thousands of years ago. So I'm working on COVID time at the moment.
Yeah, 2014, Brandon Lewis's, the Brandon Lewis era. The written ministerial statement.
I suppose it's telling that it's taken this long between 14 and now for sort of vacant building credit to get any sort of prominence, and there does appear, from my experience, certainly a very, very low take-up on vacant building credit, which seems to indicate, its usefulness hasn't been fully exploited or certainly not applied consistently, even though the government's intention is absolutely crystal clear, I would say.
And to bring it full circle, we can go to the Planning for the Future document from the 12th of March, pre-lockdown, where again, stated up front, government will back brownfield, initiatives to invest 400 million to improve the use of brownfield land and the national brownfield map. There's a clear statement that that's what national government wants. So maybe it will be something for the work which is ongoing, the work which will continue post-lockdown, to bring VBC perhaps into more frequent use. Excellent, thank you very much. I think Piers is going to win the award for best brand placement. I liked the use of the King's Chambers pen as you were making your points. Brand recognition high, well done. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening. As I said at the outset, the background paper will be put onto the King's Chambers website, as will, I suppose I don't need to tell you if you're already watching this, but perhaps if you are already watching this, I can tell you that the audio is also available, so you can stop watching it and go back to the more traditional podcast version. Thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe and speak soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.